Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to our channel, Pakistan Zindabad, the next world superpower.
It's great to be with you again. Today, we're doing a really crucial historical unpacking.
We absolutely are. We are jumping into a monumental subject, how states are truly built, and maybe more importantly, who gets to design the blueprint.
And today, we're focusing on the foundational role of the Pakistan Army in literally constructing the state's institutions during its first incredibly volatile 3 decades.
Right, we're talking about the 1950s all the way through the 1970s. And for those of you following our broader material, this deep dive is essentially our analysis of what's framed as Episode 43.
Which is drawn from the book The Generals of Pakistan, written by Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir. It's a work that, it really challenges the conventional view of state formation in the region.
It really does. So our mission here, for you, is to look beyond the headlines of military takeovers.
Exactly. We're not just talking about coups. We want to dissect the historical narrative that positions the army not just as a defense force, but as the foundational architect of the state.
Its administrative backbone, its intelligence agencies, even its first steps into technology.
We're analyzing the specific nuts and bolts, the mechanisms they built, and the cultural shifts they really imposed on the system.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the core idea here is, well, it's profound. We're talking about a complete transformation.
A metamorphosis, really.
Yeah. The Pakistan Army moves from being this traditional, battlefield force
Focused only on defense, as you'd expect.
into the primary architect of the state itself. This isn't just about a change in power. It's about a change in the very function of an institution.
That's the key distinction. This deep dive is about systems building, the hardware and the software of a nation-state, not just military strategy.
So we need to understand how and why the military establishment stepped in to create predictability.
Right. At the exact moment when political stability was, just a memory and the civil bureaucracy had utterly collapsed, the source argues they were the last functional organization left standing.
An institutional history, not a purely political one. That's a great way to put it.
It's about structure, not just about power.
So let's set the stage. Take us back to the early days of Pakistan, the late 40s, early 50s.
Well, at its birth, the military was exactly what you'd think it was, a defense force. Its main job was securing these incredibly porous, highly contested borders right after the trauma of partition.
But the source materials suggest the mandate changed, and it changed very, very quickly.
It had to. The pressures were immediate and, frankly, existential. You had the conflict over Kashmir erupt almost instantly.
And the refugee crisis?
A massive refugee crisis. The logistics of just relocating millions of people were staggering for a brand new state with no infrastructure.
So you have a complete breakdown of the systems inherited from the partition.
Complete breakdown. The first few decades were just defined by one crisis after another. And crisis management, especially in a state that has no robust civic institutions, well, it falls to the most capable entity.
And according to Mr. Mir's research, that entity was, without a doubt, the army.
Unequivocally, while the political class was, caught up in infighting and constant turnover.
And the bureaucracy was fragmented and just totally under-resourced.
The military had something no one else did. A cohesive hierarchical structure and critically operational capability that it inherited from the British colonial training.
That organizational solidity was its greatest asset, wasn't it?
It was everything. The source argues that while the civilian side was basically paralyzing itself with instability, you had a new government every year, constitutional crises, regional tensions flaring up.
The army was the only institution that could actually execute a long-term plan.
Or manage huge flows of resources, or mobilize people on a national scale. It was the only thing that worked.
Which brings us back to that core phrase. The army transformed into the primary architect of the state.
It wasn't a slow evolution. It was a foundational shift driven by that vacuum you mentioned.
So let's talk about the why. What was this vacuum they felt they had to fill?
And the why is the most critical part. It tells you how institutions evolve under extreme stress, especially in new nations. The source points to 2 catastrophic failures in the civilian world that just left this operational void.
First, that profound political instability.
Yes. If a government can't even survive a year, how can it pass laws? How can it enact long-term policy or make tough economic choices?
It can't. There was just this chronic failure to build any kind of national consensus or a stable party system that could actually run a modern state.
And the second failure was the collapsing civil bureaucracy, the machine they inherited from the British Raj. It just wasn't fit for purpose.
What do you mean by that? It was a functioning system, wasn't it?
It was designed to maintain the status quo. Its job was to collect revenue and keep order for an imperial power. It was built to be conservative, slow, and fragmented.
So it was completely unable to handle the demands of a young, populous, geographically divided state that needed to modernize and develop, like yesterday.
Right. It was like trying to run a modern development project with a colonial-era machine designed to be deliberately slow. It was built to say no, not to say, how fast can we build this?
And into that void where the civilian side just couldn't act decisively.
The military could. They had that capacity in abundance. And this created what the source calls the intervention mentality.
Which is a really important concept.
Yeah.
The book argues they didn't just intervene to seize power.
No, not initially. They intervened to build systems where there were none, or where the old ones had completely failed.
So if you needed a national power grid built, or a census done, or to root out massive corruption,
The military was the only organization that could deliver. It was less about political ambition at that point and more about a functional necessity being met by the only functional group available.
and that right there set the precedent for their pervasive, long-lasting role in the state's architecture.
It did. They weren't just protecting the country from outside threats. They were protecting the very mechanisms of the country from falling apart internally. They brought discipline, hierarchy, clear timelines.
Where before there was just chaos and uncertainty.
It's the difference between just reacting to a crisis and actually engineering a new structure to prevent future ones. That's a powerful distinction. They became the institution of continuity in a sea of political discontinuity.
Okay, so this brings us directly to the period after 1958. The source identifies this as a huge turning point.
It is. This is where we see the move toward what the book calls professionalized governance under direct military oversight.
This is where the regimented, disciplined approach of the Army meets the messy, unpredictable world of civil administration.
Exactly. This is the era of military administration, not just intervention. The goal was to impose efficiency, and the tools they used came straight from the military command structure. They wanted to build institutional habits.
Clarity, rigor, accountability.
Precisely. All the things that political habits had, pushed aside in favor of corruption and uncertainty.
So let's get concrete. What were the specific reforms? What structures did they overhaul or create from scratch?
The source gives us a really clear list, and it starts at the local level, which is where the average citizen actually interacts with the state. The first big one was creating new district administration frameworks.
Right, the district commissioner, the local magistrate, that's the face of the state for most people. If that's broken, the whole system feels broken.
And it was broken. You had no clear, standardized procedures at the local level. It was a mess. So the military framework aimed to rationalize it all, make the rules clear, the hierarchy work, the paperwork uniform.
Can you give us an example?
Take the Patwari system, the local land record keepers. It was a system inherited from the Raj, and it was notoriously corrupt and outdated.
A source of immense local power and graft.
Absolutely. Land records were often just these local paper ledgers. They were easy to bribe, to manipulate, to just plain lose. The military came in and imposed mandatory standardization.
Yeah.
They set timelines for updates, they created verification mechanisms, and sometimes they even sent military personnel to supervise the process directly. This simple administrative rigor, well, it reduced ownership disputes and, critically, it allowed the state to tax land accurately,
Which stabilized revenue.
which is the lifeblood of a new state. And this was all backed by the military's authority, which gave it the teeth a weak civilian government would have lacked.
This is also when we see the big, highly publicized anti-corruption drives.
Yes, and these were led by direct military oversight, often with summary proceedings.
They served a strategic purpose beyond just morality, didn't they?
A huge one. Sure, it rooted out inefficiency that was crippling the economy, but maybe more importantly, these drives legitimized the military's role in the public's eyes.
They were seen as the clean sweepers.
Right. Using military rigor swift investigations, clear charges, real punishment to bring accountability where politics had only brought impunity. For a public that's skeptical of its political institutions, seeing the military deliver visible justice against powerful, corrupt figures is a massive political win.
It reinforces that idea of them as the nation's ultimate guardian.
It does. And then we see this detailed reorganization across major public sectors. We're talking about a complete restructuring of revenue collection, the police, local municipal councils,
A total redesign of the state apparatus.
aiming for one thing: efficiency and predictability. If we focus on revenue for a second, a young state needs predictable income to survive.
It's the bedrock of sovereignty.
And by bringing in standardized systems, uniform forms, strict deadlines, clear chains of responsibility borrowed straight from military quartermaster doctrine, they made sure the state could actually forecast its budget and operate. It became an institutionalized system, not a fragmented, personal one.
The source also mentions something called National Reconstruction Bureau-style early experiments. That sounds a bit like social engineering.
Well, in a way, it was. The National Reconstruction Bureau, or NRB, and similar bodies were basically military labs for governance. They reflected this mindset that the state was a project that needed to be engineered, not just governed passively.
And they introduced concepts like the basic democracies.
Exactly. The basic democracies, for our listeners, were these local governing structures. But they were designed to operate under very strict hierarchical oversight from the central government.
So it gave the appearance of local participation,
But it ensured that the central policy directives coming from the military government were implemented without getting bogged down in the slow, often corrupt civilian channels. It prioritized efficiency over unmediated democracy.
okay, I see the thesis here. Necessity drove them to build. But there's a huge trade-off, isn't there? Didn't this focus on top-down, command-style solutions actually prevent the natural development of political compromise and legislative skill that a democracy needs?
That is the critical counterargument, and the source does grapple with it. The military's position was that they were buying the state vital time to survive its childhood. But the analysis suggests that the efficiency you get from martial law creates an institutional addiction to those kinds of solutions.
It teaches the state to rely on the hammer of the military instead of learning the complex art of negotiation.
Perfectly put. And that makes the eventual return to real political processes much, much harder. This trade-off, stability now versus political maturation later, that's the lasting legacy of these reforms.
So for the learner, what was the immediate result of all this rewiring?
The immediate result was essential predictability in governance. If you're a young nation fighting for survival, uncertainty is your greatest enemy. By creating clear chains of command, standard paperwork, and enforceable timelines, the military gave the state a functional predictability it desperately needed. They professionalized the machine.
So they fixed the internal mechanics. But that only works if the state can survive its external environment.
Which brings us to the evolution of its security and intelligence apparatus. This is where we go from district councils to building national capacity on a global scale.
And this might be the most enduring part of the blueprint.
I think it is. The military leadership knew very early on that a modern state needs a sophisticated, proactive intelligence structure, something far beyond what a traditional army provides on the battlefield.
Let's start with the ISI transformation. The source describes the Inter-Services Intelligence, the ISI, starting as a small liaison wing.
That's right. Its original job was just to coordinate communication between the heads of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. It was minimalist.
And it transformed into a formidable global intelligence service. That's an exponential leap.
It was a monumental, resource-intensive leap. The restructuring under military administration turned it into an apparatus capable of complex strategic analysis, external monitoring, counterintelligence, and eventually covert operations. The military poured resources into training, tech, and organization.
So how did that increase the state's external capability? What new parts emerged?
It meant creating specialized directorates. You had units focused specifically on India, others on the growing influence operations in Afghanistan. This involved dedicated analytical wings trained in geopolitical assessment, economic intelligence, handling human assets.
It gave the state eyes and ears far beyond its borders.
It allowed Pakistan to project influence and manage threats proactively at a distance, instead of just waiting for them to arrive. It massively enhanced its strategic depth.
And this was happening at the same time as the growth of military intelligence, or MI.
Yes, and MI's focus deepened almost exclusively on internal affairs. While ISI looked out, MI looked in.
focusing on internal security and counter-subversion roles.
In a politically and ethnically volatile new country, that internal function was just as important. MI's job was to ensure the stability and loyalty of the infrastructure inside the borders.
So in the 60s and 70s, what was MI actually doing?
They were monitoring key political figures, tracking linguistic and regional separatist movements, and making sure strategic assets like defense production plants or communication hubs were secure from sabotage or foreign infiltration. They were the operational arm that guaranteed the administrative reforms we just talked about could actually be implemented without disruption.
They were the guarantors of internal coherence.
You could say that. The source also notes their improved analysis for cross-border infiltration in Kashmir. This was a move beyond simple defense.
This sounds like hybrid warfare.
It is. It required intelligence that focused not just on enemy armies, but on understanding non-state actors, their logistics, their financing, the deeper currents that destabilize a region. This needed dedicated analytical units and tech investment, again, driven by the military's mission-oriented approach.
Okay, but here is where it gets truly fascinating for me and connects this history directly to today. The source mentions early cyber surveillance concepts, even in the 1970s.
It sounds anachronistic, but it's true.
What on earth did proto-cyber intelligence look like back then?
This is where you see the foresight of the military leadership. In the 1970s, cyber surveillance meant the sophisticated monitoring of the new electronic communications infrastructure. We're talking about dedicated investment in monitoring telecommunications networks, international telex traffic, early satellite relays.
So they weren't just reading letters, they were tapping into the emerging digital bloodstream of the state.
Precisely. They were actively investing in highly specialized, often imported equipment, early encryption tools, massive tape drives, the first computer systems, and training an elite group of people who could intercept and analyze huge volumes of electronic data.
So the birth of data-driven intelligence in Pakistan didn't happen in a civilian IT department.
It happened within the secure, resource-rich walls of the intelligence establishment. They understood that communications infrastructure itself was becoming a critical domain of intelligence.
So what's the big takeaway here?
So, what is profound? This intelligence ecosystem made Pakistan's security proactive, not reactive. They built a structure designed not just to repel attacks, but to anticipate and manage strategic challenges, both internal and external.
Okay, so we've covered the hardware, the agencies, the districts. Now let's talk about the cultural software that ran it all. How did the military's way of thinking permeate the civil service?
Well, when a military commander takes over a civilian department, they bring a culture built on non-negotiable values: chain of command, timeliness, verifiable results. And these were the exact things missing from the slow, fragmented bureaucracy they found.
The source mentions the introduction of punctuality systems. It sounds so simple, but it must have been revolutionary.
It's the building block of efficiency. In the 50s and 60s, bureaucratic delays were measured in weeks or months. That cripples economic planning, it delays services.
So they brought in sign-in sheets.
And much more. Strict reporting standards, work registers, but also immediate, visible inspections and consequences. They imposed a culture where time was treated as a managed operational resource. It forced files to move, meetings to end, decisions to be made. It injected velocity into the state machine.
And this was linked to standardized reporting.
Yes. Instead of every department using its own weird forms and metrics, they imposed uniformity from the top down.
Why is that so important?
Because uniformity allows for central planning and coordination. If you create one way for everyone to document things, request resources, and communicate from the Ministry of Education to a tiny irrigation office in a remote province, then the data is comparable. Information can flow up and down the chain of command efficiently.
It's pure military doctrine. A standardized field report lets the general see the whole battlefield.
In this case, the head of state can synthesize the national picture rapidly, without confusion, and this leads directly to the next big culture shift: the move toward performance-based evaluations.
A rejection of the old system based on seniority or who you knew.
This is where accountability gets its teeth. When you shift from an opaque, time-served career path to one based on metrics, you change the incentives. Bureaucrats suddenly had to produce measurable results.
Tax collection targets, road construction milestones.
Exactly. It mirrored the military's absolute focus on mission completion. It fostered an output-oriented professionalism, replacing the inertia that you often find in civil service jobs that lack clear performance benchmarks.
And the mechanism to enforce all this was the chain of command model.
Borrowed directly from the military. It created a single, unambiguous flow of authority that just cut through the confusing, inherited civilian protocols. In a military operation, confusion about who gives orders is lethal. Applied to government, it ensures that once a policy is issued, it moves swiftly through the entire system without getting bogged down in committees or turf wars.
So the overall impact was undeniable, according to the source. It reduced chaos and created a culture of accountability.
It did. The military imported its most valuable cultural asset, discipline. And in this context, accountability wasn't just about punishment. It was about defining responsibility and creating a verifiable output stream. That's the prerequisite for any state to function effectively.
But the question remains, does imposing military discipline on a civil service ultimately equip it to thrive in democracy? Or does it just teach it to wait for orders instead of innovating?
That is the ultimate dilemma. The system was engineered for stability and survival, not necessarily for democratic creativity. It's a temporary fix with potentially permanent side effects.
Okay, this next section is one that always surprises people. We think of the 1970s as low-tech, but the source details the Army's intense focus on integrating new technology way before it was mainstream.
It really highlights the difference between institutional necessity and consumer adoption. The military is always the first to adopt expensive, specialized tech because it needs that strategic edge.
So let's get into these proto-digital initiatives of the 70s. First up, mapping and GIS. The military mapping units started adopting proto-GIS systems. What did that actually look like?
We're not talking about Google Maps here. We're talking about highly specific mainframe computer systems, often imported. Imagine these huge drafting tables linked to very basic computers. You'd use large format digitizers and punch cards to integrate multiple layers of data.
What kind of data?
Topographical surveys, detailed land ownership maps, military reconnaissance photos, and crucially, census information.
So the real innovation wasn't just the hardware, it was creating these central data repositories.
Precisely. And this data centralization, managed by the highly trained people in the Signals Corps, allowed the state to scientifically model complex scenarios for the first time. They could model flood risks, optimize where to build irrigation canals, forecast population growth for city planning. It was the birth of national data management, all driven by military needs.
And the Signals Corps was also updating the national communication infrastructure. This is bigger than just battlefield radios.
Much bigger. The Signals Corps is trained to build robust, secure communication systems that work under extreme stress. When they took on modernizing the national grid, telephony, radio, telegraph, they brought that expertise to the civilian sector. They had the skilled engineers and the strict technical standards to upgrade the old, antiquated civil infrastructure.
Because national command and control, military or administrative, relies on good communication.
Fundamentally, you need reliable, secure links between the capital and the provinces. They built that. We also see them integrating complex early warning systems, like early radar networks.
Which requires a huge investment.
Massive. You need the high-tech infrastructure, reliable power sources, and highly specialized classified training. This was way beyond the scope of any single civilian ministry at the time. By deploying and maintaining these systems, the military laid the foundation for the modern air defense and security monitoring that the nation would rely on for decades.
And finally, the source mentions the beginning of data-based logistics planning.
This brings us back to efficiency. Logistics moving resources, people, and supplies quickly and in a coordinated way is the core competency of any large military. By using those early computers we talked about, they started to optimize transportation routes, forecast resource needs for huge projects like dam construction, and manage national inventory.
Something a manual, paper-based bureaucracy could never do at that scale.
Not even close. The long-term relevance of all this is profound. The source says these early seeds became the backbone of Pakistan's cyber and digital capabilities later on.
And you can see why.
Absolutely. Think about the legacy. The people trained to manage these early radar, signals, and data systems. They became the first generation of Pakistani engineers and IT professionals who could handle complex national digital architecture years later. That talent pool, that foundational infrastructure, and that institutional know-how to manage high-tech systems was all military-derived.
Okay, so after detailing all of this, administration, intelligence, culture, technology, we have to circle back to the root cause. Why did the Army take on this huge, non-traditional role?
We have to remember the narrative in the source. The Army saw itself as an institutional path corrector. It was stepping into voids that threatened the entire project of Pakistan. They had the organization, the singular memory, the training, and the political will to enact rapid change when the civilian sector was paralyzed.
The book lists four major deficiencies they were trying to correct. The first is the root cause of it all, the absence of a stable political party system.
That's it. Without stable parties that could form and hold governments, the civilian side was just trapped in this cycle of short-term crisis management and debilitating instability. The military stepped in to provide the continuity and long-term planning horizon that the political sector just couldn't deliver.
The second factor was the chronic weakness of the civil bureaucracy, which we've talked about.
It lacked the discipline and the centralized authority to implement reforms quickly. It was prone to local corruption and inefficiency. The military provided a temporary, but very effective, override a command structure to force the machine into action.
Third, those persistent external threats, especially from India and Afghanistan. These were active, continuous pressures.
Which meant the state was always operating on something like a war footing. Defense spending and strategic planning naturally centralized power and resources within the military. When your main job is ensuring the state survives against existential threats, your scope tends to expand to make sure everything internal, the economy, logistics, communications, supports that mission. Internal weakness becomes an external vulnerability.
And finally, the structural need for rapid modernization across the board.
Exactly. Developing nations in the mid-20th century couldn't afford to wait decades for institutions to mature organically. They needed a fast, focused injection of technology and planning. And since the military was the best, and maybe only, institution equipped to handle large-scale coordinated projects,
They became the default engine of modernization.
this is where the source reaffirms its core thesis. The military didn't just intervene, it engineered state survival. It frames their actions not as a simple power grab, but as an institutional imperative to keep the state itself from disintegrating.
But to maintain our neutrality here, we have to talk about the cost of this engineering. It provided stability, sure, but didn't it also fundamentally undermine the capacity of the very political institutions the military said it was protecting?
The source certainly implies that cost. By repeatedly stepping in to solve problems with military efficiency, you effectively disincentivize the political class from developing its own robust democratic solutions. Every time the military provides a stable blueprint, it reinforces a structural dependence on non-elected authority.
It locks in a dominant institutional culture at the expense of political growth.
And that systemic dependency is the long-term price you pay for that short-term discipline stability.
So we arrive at the legacy. By the late 1970s, what kind of state had been forged? What was the lasting impact of this commander's blueprint?
By the late 70s, Pakistan's identity was unique. The army was established not just as the primary defender of the nation, but as its primary state builder. That dual role is crucial. It gave the military a moral and institutional legitimacy that came not just from defense, but from having successfully run, stabilized, and modernized the state when civilian hands had failed.
And this blueprint wasn't a one-and-done thing. It became the foundation for continuous refinement.
Absolutely. The systems they built for tax collection, infrastructure, intelligence, security were highly functional. Future governments, military or civilian, inherited them. They didn't have to invent basic state functions from scratch. They just used the existing blueprint and adapted it for new challenges. That institutional memory is the true measure of its longevity.
The source names specific figures who continued this tradition, bridging the gap to the modern era: Zia, Musharraf, Asim Munir.
And naming them highlights the enduring, cross-generational nature of this role. Each of them, in their time, relied on, expanded, and refined the mechanisms and cultures established in those early decades. Whether it was economic planning, intelligence operations, or tech modernization, it suggests the blueprint is continuously being updated, always with the military as the central organizational force.
Let's tie it all together then. What did our listener just learn was fundamentally shaped by this early military blueprint?
The core takeaway is that it touches every layer of the state. The institutions you see in Pakistan today, the administrative frameworks, the capacity for mass resource management, the sophisticated intelligence ecosystem of the ISI and MI, the hierarchical structure of governance, and the very foundations of the country's high-tech and cyber capabilities were all shaped, stabilized, and professionalized by this blueprint.
A singular, massive institutional engineering project.
Designed to create state survival out of the chaos of its birth. It really forces you to ask whether the military's role in a post-colonial state is inherently broader than just defense, especially when all other state functions are unstable.
This has been a truly comprehensive deep dive. We started with the immense pressure of political instability and a collapsing bureaucracy.
And we tracked the military's strategic response. Not just defending borders, but completely restructuring the state's internal functions.
We've seen the impact everywhere, from standardized district administration and anti-corruption drives to building a global intelligence service and laying the seeds for proto-GIS systems in the 1970s.
The emphasis was always on predictability, accountability, and the rapid adoption of technology.
So here's the final thought for you, something to mull over. If state survival and institutional predictability are successfully engineered by a highly disciplined, non-political entity, specifically because the political class repeatedly failed to deliver stability,
Then what are the inherent long-term trade-offs between stability built through military discipline and the kind of stability that's won through messy, volatile, democratic negotiation? Does the existential need for predictability in a developing nation necessarily require the methods of a centralized military structure? And if it does, how does that state ever fully transition to civilian control? That tension discipline versus democracy is the core legacy built into this commander's blueprint.
a truly compelling and complex question. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the historical architects of Pakistan's state capacity. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.